Good afternoon if you're in the UK, good morning if you're in the US, and good whatever it is, wherever else you may be in the world. Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast live. Just to check you are listening live, my normal time check, it is now 3:10 in the afternoon in the UK on Monday is it Monday? I think it's Tuesday today, isn't it? I'm already losing track of the week. Tuesday, the 18th of January. I do know it's 2022. I've got used to that by now. But welcome whenever you're listening. If you are joining us live, please feel free to join in on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on YouTube. Type in your comments and we'll give you a shout out if we're able to, and feed your comments and your questions into the conversation. I always come on to these calls saying that I should have checked dates for forthcoming podcasts in advance and apologising for not doing so. Today I've actually a little bit more organised, and the next two podcasts are actually already live on the various platforms. So on Friday this week at 9 a.m. UK time, I will be interviewing Rebecca Robbins, who's a senior leader in talent and development for the global branding agency Interbrands, and we'll be talking about nurturing the talent of the future and equipping them to make the connections they need to forge a successful career. And I'm excited about that one, and I'm very excited about the next Friday on the 28th, I believe it is, at 9:30 a.m. where, as a big football fan, I am delighted to be interviewing the Chelsea, Everton and Scotland legend, Pat Nevin. I've recently read Pat's biography, absolutely fascinating read. And you may think, well, what has an international footballer got to do with professional relationships, connected leadership? Pat really stood out during his career and has done since. Not your typical footballer. His memoir is called The Accidental Footballer. Very different interests to most of his teammates, but he still managed to forge brilliant relationships wherever he played. He was Player of the Year wherever he played. Very successful career. And he also was at Chelsea at a time when racism in football was rife and hooliganism, and Chelsea were unfortunately at the centre of a lot of that, and he stood up to it, and he was one of the first players to actually speak publicly about what was wrong with racism and hooliganism, and I think that there's a lot that we can talk about there, how he managed to do that and still keep a bond with the fans that he was speaking out against, and actually get them to listen to him. So I think that'd be a really exciting podcast. So those are the next two that we've got in the diary, on Friday this week and Friday next week, 9 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. respectively UK time. So please do join us for those. I can see we've got people tuning in live. Please note in the comments who you are. I'll be delighted to welcome you to the podcast. I've got someone as my guest today who I've been looking forward to get on the podcast for a very long time. He's someone who I was introduced to a number of years ago, I'd say about 3 or 4 years ago. And through our initial conversations, he's opened doors for me that have subsequently opened further doors, and my network in New York in particular and across the States has grown with the help of his initial work and introductions, and I think that's very relevant to the conversation that we're going to have today. He's a host of the podcast himself, Access to Anyone, which shows you how to get in front of anyone you want to in business using relationship building principles that are very similar to the type that we talk about on the Connected Leadership podcast and that I share in my books. And in fact, I've been a guest on the Access to Anyone podcast. I think I may have been on it twice, actually, thinking about it. He's built his own methodology that is based on his experience of going from being a high school English teacher to becoming a Broadway producer in a couple of years. And he worked on shows that I've seen and loved, such as American Idiot, the Green Day musical, and Scottsboro Boys. So an interesting backstory as well. Our focus today, however, is going to be on this theme of referability. Now, when I've talked about referability over the years, my primary focus has tended to be from a sales perspective, getting people to refer you for your products or your services. I also do talk about it from an individual perspective, and we had a good conversation about that just before Christmas on the live broadcast with Leslie Everett, also in the States. And that's where we're going to focus today. Referability for an individual. And in particular, why would people recommend you? So first of all, please welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast, my good friend, Michael Roderick. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And I'm excited to have you on. Is it twice I've been on Access to Anyone? I think it has
I
actually.
think it's possible.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think yeah, because I had a co-host at the beginning of the
yeah,
process, and I think you were
that's
on with the
right.
co-host,
I
and then
was.
I think we did a solo episode
Yeah,
once your other book came out. So
yeah.
yeah,
So we're playing catch up.
exactly.
We're now 2-1. We're now 2-1. So we'll find a way to bring it all square at some point. But thank you very much for joining me. I think your friendship is something that I've really appreciated. Your expertise is something I respect, and I think that you're the ideal person to build on what we talked about before Christmas in terms of personal branding from an individual perspective, and look at okay, you build that brand. Why would people actually recommend it? And the two things are very
Mm,
closely intertwined. So let's start by looking. I think when we look at this topic of why people would recommend you, I think it's too easy, and it's almost a natural thing for people like you and I to start from the perspective of the person who wants to be recommended. What do you need to
mm.
do in order to be referable, in order to be someone people want to recommend? But actually, it makes more sense to start from the perspective of the people doing the recommending. If you can understand
Mm.
their psychology, if you can understand their motivations, then you can answer those questions better. So let's start. What are people considering when they're looking at whether or not they're going to recommend, whether it's individuals or whether it's business in this case? Let's start from there. What's important to people when they're going to make strong recommendations and put their name on the line?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I always like to say about this is that people love to feel useful, they hate to feel used. And ultimately, if somebody's going to be recommending you, going to be recommending your service, they want to feel useful. They want to feel like they are actually bringing something to their network, to the people within their world. So what I find happens very, very often is that people will focus on what it is that they do, and they'll basically be like, okay, well, let me like break down exactly what I do, and here's how I do it, and here's how to refer me, and all of these different types of things. And what they want to do is, I refer to it as giving yourself an F. What they want to do is they want to talk about what they do for their clients,
Yeah.
right? What is the thing that you're actually doing for somebody else? How are you breaking it down so that if somebody hears it, they say, oh, yeah, I know somebody who is struggling with that particular challenge and could really use that help and that support. And the more that you craft your description, your way of discussing what you do in the context of what you're doing for the client, the problem that you're actually solving, the more likely somebody's going to want to recommend you, because they're going to feel like the savior when their friend is complaining about whatever that issue is, and say, oh, yes, I know somebody who can help you with that. I know somebody who can support that. But most of the time, the mistake that I see is we spend far too much time trying to explain to people what we do, how we do it, what our background is, what our experience is, how many years we worked in a particular industry, when none of that really helps us from a
Yeah.
referral standpoint.
Yeah, I love that. I love that people like to feel useful. They don't like to feel used. I think that really gets to the nub of it, because there is that fear that people have, and it's genuine in some cases. If people really don't balance this out and only think of themselves, but there's that fear that you could be seen to be a burden to other people, a drain on other people if you're constantly asking for help. And this point about really helping people understand the benefits of what you do and the impact it will have on other people. When I teach referral strategy to sales teams, I have a model for the message that is problem, solution, benefit. What problem you solve, how you do it, not in the great detail, but what it involves, and then as a result, ... And I talk about a virtuous triangle. And a good recommendation means that the person being recommended wins as a result. The person who's having the recommendation given to them benefits as a result. And therefore, as the person making the recommendation, you're a winner in both their eyes. And I think that really goes to the nub of what you're saying. Think of all parties, and when you're asking for that introduction, don't make it about you, make it about them.
Exactly.
So once we understand that, and let's stick within the psychology of the person making the introduction, even if we can make it more a more natural process, an easier thing to give, something that makes more sense to them, rather than just asking for a favour, there are still many people who are more inclined to refer than others, or recommend. Some people will recommend you within minutes of meeting you, and I know that there are. It does pain me to some degree, I'll be honest, but there are networking trainers who will say, don't ask what do you do, ask how can I help you. And I think, okay, get to know someone first.
Exactly.
When someone opens with that with me, I really want to get out of that conversation straight away, because I'm thinking, call me a cynic, you don't know me, why would you want to help me to that degree? But why is it that, okay, some people are doing that because they've been taught that's how to open a conversation. Some people genuinely are happy to recommend and refer and open up their network to complete strangers. Others need to know you 10 years. Meet your wife, meet your kids, and know your inside leg measurement before they'll recommend you. Why do you think that is?
So I look at it as there is a nuance to this idea of reciprocity that very, very few people recognize and understand. And most of the time when we hear about the idea of reciprocity, the thought process is, I'm going to do something for you, and then you're naturally going to want to do something for me. And that's kind of how the world, that's how this sort of whole thing works. And really, that's where this how can I help you sort of opening came from, because you had all these people kind of worshiping reciprocity and considering that to be the thing that was going to solve everything. But the thing that we forget about in regards to the nuances of reciprocity is that every single person has a reciprocity impulse as well as a reciprocity timeline. So I'll start with reciprocity impulse. There are some people who, if you do something for them, it is like a hot potato. They have to throw it back to you. They can't just receive. They're just like, here you go, I must do something. And that's a very strong reciprocity impulse. So you'll find if somebody has a very, very strong reciprocity impulse, in many cases, even though they haven't done sort of that deep dive with you in terms of referring or recommending, that's their way of showing reciprocity and to basically act on that reciprocity impulse. Now, there are people who don't have a very strong reciprocity impulse, who in their life, they've always kind of gotten the things that they want. People have always kind of just done things for them. So they have this feeling of, well, this is just the way the world works. People just give me things, right? Like that's kind of how this all goes. So if they have a weak reciprocity impulse, you're going to need to spend a lot more time basically helping them understand that you need something. Like you do have to be more, you have to be more proactive and explaining what they could help you with and how that help could work in regards to a referral. So if you are encountering somebody and they don't have a very strong reciprocity impulse, you may think, oh man, like, well, why aren't they helping? But the thing is, they don't necessarily think that way. So you have to pay attention to that. And that's one of the nuances. But the second nuance is this idea of a reciprocity timeline. And there are some people who again, it comes to them. They want to give it back right away because they want to keep this all moving quickly, right? There are some people who they just want to do the referrals. They want to make it happen. But then there are others who there is a large amount of weight attached to their referrals, and they know that. So they have a longer reciprocity timeline because they vet you. They figure out, should you get that introduction? Should you be connected to their network? And they will test to see, are you a person of your word? Are you doing the things that you say you're going to do? What kind of credibility do you already have? And the thing is, these people will take the time to vet. And I see it all the time where folks get all upset and, feel like, oh, well, that person never refers me, etc. And you look at the person, it's like, well, yeah, they don't refer very often at all because they vet their people and they spend a lot of time vetting their people. So I think that if we don't pay attention to that nuance in reciprocity, we can have all sorts of mixed signals about, is somebody referring us? Are they not referring us? How are they thinking about this? And that whole kind of process.
A lot of that clearly comes down to communication. I think that there's a number of questions or expansions on the topic that are springing to my mind. One of them is where do you think the right position is? Do you think it is good to have a strong reciprocity reflex where you are looking to reciprocate with every time someone helps you? I'm not suggesting that not having one at all is a good thing, and perhaps someone needs to address that. But my approach, for example, is that yes, I do feel I want to reciprocate, but actually I recognise that I might pay it forward, and that the support might come to you. And I look at the network as a whole. And if you take reciprocity expectations out of a conversation, then it becomes much cleaner. But as long as the willingness to reciprocate is there, if the opportunity comes. Do you think it's good to sit and wait and be aware and willing to reciprocate when the time comes, but not rush towards it? Where would you sit on that spectrum, and how would you work with someone if you recognise that maybe they're not quite sat where the relationship needs them to be?
Yeah. So the thing to understand is that these are things that are kind of deep seated in us, right? So a reciprocity impulse comes usually from our background and sort of what our experience has been. So if people have helped us and supported us in the past when we've been in high states of need, or when we've been in high moments of challenge, then we usually have a very strong reciprocity impulse. If we've been educated around relationship building in some way, and we've been exposed to this idea of reciprocity, we sometimes will have a stronger reciprocity impulse because we're sort of consistently thinking about it. So it's not so much that either way is good or bad to sort of be within the world, but the way that I like to think about it is the aspect of when I used to work in Broadway, I had a rule which was fast to view, slow to recommend. So I would go and see lots and lots of shows. I would do a lot of things. I would be in the industry, but I wouldn't recommend investors and producers came to a show until I really felt this made sense. And this is a good, and this is a good thing. Now, the thing is, that doesn't necessarily mean that I didn't reciprocate if somebody was kind or sort of thoughtful, or, said, hey, come and see my show. It just meant that I was careful about the choices I made in terms of those referrals, in terms of those connections, and sort of that particular process. So the thing is, I don't think it's so much that it's good or bad in terms of where your reciprocity impulse is, or sort of how you form, because that's kind of who you are. I think it's more about, as you identify sort of where you land for yourself or where somebody else lands, you start to think about, how do I frame this conversation? How do I approach this relationship? And you approach it in more of that sort of on case by case basis, as opposed to deciding, because the big issue, the reason why this nuance of reciprocity is often missed, is the fact that we tend to think in right or wrong, as opposed to thinking in the context of, well, each case has its own nuances. So I always look at it from that angle. I look at it from the angle of, okay, well, what's the experience that I'm having? Okay, this person has a very, very strong reciprocity impulse, right? They're asking me how they can help. They feel like they need to, they feel like they need to help. Okay, great. What can I suggest or what can I mention to them that will help satisfy that, right? Or, you know what? It looks like this person doesn't have a very strong reciprocity impulse, but there are things that they're involved in that I'm interested in. So let me just ask them, about if they have any ideas or if they have any thoughts as to what I'm trying to get across or what I'm trying to have happen. If that is a referral saying, this is the problem I solve, and I'm just curious, is there anybody that that fits this category, that actually like falls into this category? Or and if so, I'd love to know more, and just see kind of where it goes, and then you just sort of feel it out kind of as you go from each sort of phase.
I want to come back to this point that you everyone's different, and you treat people differently, because I think that's an important question. But I wanted, before we do that, you talked about when you were a producer on Broadway, you would view quickly, recommend slowly, and you would be sure that it was the right thing for an investor before inviting them along to view. That comes down to trust. That comes down to giving yourself the confidence to recommend, which comes under the banner of trust, which is something we've talked about time and again on the podcast because it's so important. So for you, what is it that you think makes people trust? And again, I know that everyone is slightly different on this, and people will be motivated to trust for different reasons. It comes back to that question of people. I guess people who are quick to recommend are either happy to suspend distrust, or they're quick to trust, to embrace trust. Whereas people are slow, actually want full confidence before. What do you think are the key things people are looking for?
Yeah, I think that when people look at trust, they look for consistency. And I often have said that basically there are really only two steps to just completely blowing people's minds. And the first step is you do what you say you're going to do. The second step is you do it promptly. And most of the time, that's the bar. Most of the time, that's the biggest aspect. If you say you're going to do something, if you commit to something, if you say that you're going to make an intro, support somebody in some way, read somebody's book, whatever it is, do you follow through on that commitment? Do you do the thing that you say you're going to do? And if you do that on a consistent basis, if they know that every time that they ask you about something, or that you say you're going to do something, that you're going to do it, that level of trust goes up. But if you don't do it, if it sort of falls by the wayside, well, then that level of trust goes down. And I think that really that's at the heart of trust. We trust people who follow through and do what they say they're going to do. We trust people who respect the relationships that we have, right? And the relationships that we set up. We trust those people. And once we start to get to that point of trust, then yes, referrals are going to happen faster. We're going to recommend people more the more trust we place in them. And it's that aspect of being consistent and doing what you say you're going to do. And I think that it seems rudimentary, like it seems like kind of the simplest of things. But over and over and over again, we learn that simple is not easy.
Yeah.
Right?
So to bring that to life a little bit, when you were in that Broadway role and you had that, you've gone to see a show, you think that there's potential there. What are you looking for before you are willing to recommend it to possible investors?
Yeah.
And have you seen the show at
yeah,
that stage, or is it a pitch?
yeah. I've done everything from go to a reading to go and see a show go and see a show downtown that then I would recommend sort of up the chain, right? And the way that I would look at it is I would first look at, is it a quality, is it a quality piece, right? Is it a quality piece? But I wouldn't just recommend it based off of the fact that it was a quality piece. I would look at the people who worked on it and look at, okay, well, what's their process, sort of where do they stand, where do they stand? If I got a chance to talk to somebody who had worked on it, I would also pay attention to that. Like, how does this person sort of approach things? How do I feel? Like, what's my gut on sort of who that person is? And then based on all of those factors, I'd say, okay, I think this can be recommended. Like, I think this is a really, really solid piece, and I think these are really solid people. Now, sometimes I might not have met the team, but I just thought the project was phenomenal. And if I would go to other producers, I'd say, listen, I do not know the team personally. I do not know these people, but I saw this, and I would feel bad if I didn't let you know about it. Like, I would feel bad if I didn't let you know about it, because it is just phenomenal. And I really think, it's something that's kind of undiscovered right now. And I think it's worth checking out. So that would be the way that I would approach it.
So what you've just described there is what I call a qualified recommendation or referral. So you're qualifying your statement with the limitations, whereas an unqualified one would be, oh my God, these people are amazing, team is great, and the show is great. So just sticking on that theme for a moment, because I am, as a theatre fan, I'm fascinated, by the industry, but I think this is applicable elsewhere. To what degree does word of mouth play in the success of a show at all the different stages, and what are the key things beyond what you've talked about in terms of the background at the investment stage that really spark that word of mouth in the right places?
Yeah, I mean, I think that word of mouth has a lot of power. I knew producers who would not go and see anything unless at least 5 people came to them and recommended it. Like, I've known producers that was sort of their bar. If they didn't hear about it from 5 different people, if 5 different people didn't email them or call them and say, you need to see this, even though it might have gotten a bunch of awards, even though a bunch of people were talking about it, they wouldn't go, right? So it's that aspect of the word of mouth is very important. It is, it's a big piece of the puzzle. People have to be talking about it in order for it to even remotely get the attention of the producer, right? But once that has happened, like once you've kind of gotten to that place of word of mouth, well, then it's a question of, okay, who are you getting in to see it? Because if you get somebody in to see it and they become an advocate for it, they can get a lot more people to come and see it, right? And talk about it and share it and all of those types of things. So a lot of the time that shifts the perspective, right? That shifts the way that the show is perceived as not now just it's a word of mouth thing, but it's a word of mouth thing that's now being recommended once people have actually shown up. Because there's lots of instances where something gets word of mouth, or a lot of people talk about something, and then people go and they decide, yeah, it's not really kind of worth the hype. Like, it's not really, it's not really there. There are those instances where that does happen.
So I can see a very natural mirror to the world of general work, if you like, where you need to get recognized for where your strengths are. You need to be recognized for the benefits of what you deliver, whatever that might be, as an individual, as an organization, as a service, as a brand. But also the right people need to know about that so that you can get the word out there to the key influencers. But on top of that, you have to be consistent and deliver, which is your point you made earlier, and all those feed together quite nicely. So we can learn from those different spaces, which the idea of the podcast. So I promised we would go back to those different scenarios. Different types of people have different ways of of viewing reciprocation, of deciding what their timeline for referral, recommendation, or reciprocating those that you've given them. Do you change your behavior depending on different personality types? And if you do, how do you manage how that's perceived if people see you behaving in different ways in different scenarios?
Yeah, so it's one of those things where the behavior is relatively the same, but I may be slower or faster with certain things, right? So let's just say, for example, I meet somebody and they've got a very strong reciprocity impulse, and they're also really good at vetting, and they're really solid, and it's just like we're connectors, and we're just sort of like passing folks along to each other, and it's like this fun type of thing. I'm not really worried about that, because this person has sort of gotten to that place where they have kind of the vetting piece in place. So even though they may not have a low reciprocity impulse, they're fast to it, maybe they're just very good at vetting quickly and that type of thing. So we may really send a bunch of intros back and forth to each other, right? Like we may on that call come up with a bunch of people that we want to put each other in touch with, because it's just sort of a natural type of thing. But I might meet somebody who has a very strong reciprocity impulse, but it's very obvious that they do no vetting, right? So they're just like, oh, and here's this person that I think you should meet, and here's this person I think you should meet, and here's this person I think. So that person, I'm going to be actually much more careful about who I talk about, who I tell, who I suggest that they should meet, because they're not doing any curating, and it's going to be hard to have them just throwing people at somebody because they're so focused on that reciprocity impulse, right? If we go to the reciprocity timeline and the people who really take a lot of time, I look at it as sort of like this window type of thing. So there are people in my circle who, if I make the wrong introduction, if I connect them to somebody and it's a bad experience, the window goes like this, and then it goes like this, and then it goes like this, and it will close if I'm not thoughtful about who I'm sending their way. So for those people, I may spend a lot more time having a conversation about who is really a fit. How do you want to be introduced if this is something that you are interested in? I'll of course always check with you first, but what do you want to, what kind of ground rules do you want to set? So if I'm talking to somebody, let's say, for example, who is an investor and they write checks and that's like their thing, right? I will have a conversation with them about, if I find a company that would be a good fit, is that a conversation that you want to have? Like, do you want to talk to somebody who is actively seeking money? And if so, how do you want that to be handled? How do you want us to think, to think about that? And then I'll go back to that person and say, listen, they told me they don't want a direct pitch. So do not meet them and directly pitch them. Have a conversation, get the advice that you need to get, but treat that relationship not as a pitch. Whereas there are others who are like, yeah, send them to me, let them pitch. And I'll say, this person's open to your pitch. They want to hear what you have to say. They're open to it. They're interested in it. Go for it, kind of thing.
So again, we've got the same theme underlying what you're saying as earlier, which is communication. Be clear in your communication, yep. Listen very carefully, and be able to adapt your behaviour based on that, but also adapt how you communicate and make the connection based on that as well. Okay, so let's move on now to the individual who wants to be more referable, easier to recommend. How can you do that? How can you create a personal brand that makes people feel confident in you, even if they haven't met you before? I use the phrase, and I think you use something very similar as well. It's what people say about you when you're not in the room.
Yes, exactly.
getting that message out that gives people confidence in you before they've even met you. You talk about the producer who'll only see a show if he's heard about it 5 times, which again is on a similar line. So how can people make that happen for themselves?
Yeah, so there's three main things that you want to think about, and it's easy to remember them because it spells the word aim. And that's accessibility, influence, and memory. So the very first hurdle you're always going to have is accessibility. Will people be able to understand what it is that you're actually doing for others in a way that if they were to explain it to somebody else, they will not feel awkward?
Yeah.
And this is the thing. If you don't have that level of accessibility to whatever it is that you're offering, it's going to be very, very hard to get somebody to give you to give you a referral or to talk about you, right? Because when we talk about some idea or person or individual with somebody else, it's a reflection on us. So if we feel like we don't quite understand it, what they do, and we're like, I'm not quite sure how to explain it, we usually won't actually do the recommendation because we don't want to look silly in front of our friends, right? Like we don't want to look bad trying to explain a concept and being like, well, they do this, but I'm not quite sure what it is. So the very first thing that you always have to think about is how accessible is this idea? How accessible is this concept of what it is that I'm actually doing, for a client? Like, how clear have I made this transformation? Can I say it in one sentence, right? Like, can I help people sort of see that in a very, very clear way? And if you haven't nailed that, it's really hard to do anything else. The I is for influence. And the way that we often think about influence is that we think about it in the context of persuasion. We think about it in the context of, I want to get you to do something, so I'm going to influence you to do it through any number of tips and tricks and things like that. But true influence is when people do things without us asking them to. That's when we have true influence. And the only reason somebody's going to do something without you asking them to is if it makes them look better. So you always have to think, how does my idea, my concept, my offer, whatever it is, make somebody else look cool when they share it? And we don't think about that enough. We don't think about, if somebody else were to say this, would they look cool in front of their friends? Would they look interesting in front of their friends? But the more that we package things in that way, where if somebody shares it, they look interesting and they look cool in front of the other person, the more likely that thing will be shared. But you could have accessibility and you can have the influence piece and you can still lose without memory. Because if somebody can't remember what it is that you are offering or sharing, or what it is that you do, or what it is that your brand's about, they will share somebody else's brand, somebody else's service, not because it's better than yours, but because it's easier to remember. So the way I like to think about this is, if you want people to remember you more, you focus on less. And that's language, emotion, simplicity, and structure. So language is the first one. And the reason why most people know who Shakespeare is, but only a handful of English majors know who Christopher Marlowe is, even though they were writing around the same time, is that Shakespeare added new words to the English language. And people were going around using those words, and when you have your own language for things, when you have your own ways of saying things, it basically wedges like a piece of mental real estate in somebody's brain. They remember it. They think about it. And if you take the time to come up with your own way of saying things or play around with your own words, like those types of things, you're going to have a lot more of a memory trigger that you create. So, for example, one of the things that I often talk about is the giver's fix. And I am basically taking two words that normally would not go together, the idea of a giver and the idea of a fix, which usually has a negative connotation when we think about drug addicts and those types of scenarios. But I put them together, and it makes you curious, and you're like, well, what's the giver's fix? And if I describe to you how when we are givers and we support others and we help others, we get a chemical reaction as a result of that giving. And as a result of that chemical reaction, we get this rush, and there are people who get hooked on that rush. And just like an addict, they love feeling that they're giving and that they're helping, and they never ask for what they need. And over time, just like the addict, they're never getting the things that they actually need, so they're deteriorating. They're falling apart. And that ties to the next principle, what I just described. The reason why a lot of people will remember the giver's fix in this interview is emotion. Because what I did was I added emotion to my description of this particular idea. And if you are a person who suffers from the giver's fix, or if you know somebody who suffers from the giver's fix, what happens is you were feeling something while I was explaining that. And when you imbue emotion and emotional language to something, it helps solidify the memory. We remember things when we are in heightened states of emotion, when we feel something. So if you combine the language that you have with the emotion that you have, you're making it that much easier to remember. And then if you make it simple, simplicity is one of the most powerful tools, because academics for all of our time have always rewarded complexity. If we were in school, we got the good grades for writing the big words and writing the big papers, and we were always rewarded for being complex. But the memory rewards simplicity. So by me just making it very, very simple, right, and explaining this concept, it's easier to remember. And then the last piece, and this is why less is so effective, is structure. Because our brains need order in order to process information. We start somewhere and we go in a logical progression. It's the way our brains operate. We need a structure in order to carry that information. So when I say focus on less, language, emotion, simplicity, and structure, what I'm doing is I'm giving you an order to remember. I'm giving you a structure, which means you are more likely to share this. You are more likely to send this along because you have a package to put it in. And structure is one of the things that we often forget about, especially if we're doing a presentation, especially if we're doing a talk. How often have you seen a talk where it felt like the person was going on forever, and you were like, I don't know when it's going to end? And the reason for that was there wasn't a structure to follow. But because I've said less, you know that I've finished. You know that there isn't another S coming, right? You know exactly where we are in the conversation, which makes you more comfortable listening and knowing, oh, okay, he has finished this explanation.
How do you build that mnemonic acronym type structure into ordinary conversation? Let's move it away from the presentation scenario. To what degree would you use that structure in a one-to-one conversation?
So I would very often tap into maybe one or two of them. So if I were talking to a potential client, or if I were talking to a potential referral partner, maybe I'd throw out one of my terms, right? One of my concepts. And then I would see how do they react? Like, what do they think about it? Do they ask more questions about it? And then I would see what they ask next, right? So I would use certain terms or certain ideas or certain concepts and just see like what happens as a result of that, right? So for example, when I say referable brand and I break down this idea of having a referable brand, then I have lots of instances where people at the end of that conversation, even if they've just met me, will say, will you be on my podcast? I want to talk more about this idea or this concept. And I may share an element of AIM, or I may just share the word referable brand. On that same note, let's say I'm talking to a client and I say that one of the things that I help with a lot of the time is that there are people who they deprioritize the packaging of their intellectual property. So they never sit down and come up with that way to describe their big idea. And what am I doing? I'm tapping into the emotion, because if that person has been putting off crafting their thought leadership, then they're saying that's me. Or they're saying I know somebody who has sort of had that happen, right? Because I'm tapping into that emotion. And notice I'm always using simplicity. Have I said anything thus far in terms of having that conversation that hasn't been 2 or 3 words, right? And there's a structure there. There's always a structure to those conversations, because somebody's going to ask you about what it is that you do or what it is that you offer. And the more that you can be very succinct and tap into that emotional component, use a little bit of your own language, the more curiosity you create. And if you create curiosity, people will ask you for more information. They'll ask you to go on their show, to be introduced to their friend, or whatever the scenario is. And the thing is, we most of the time make the mistake of focusing on access. We're always about like, how do I get in front of people? How do I connect with certain people? And all these different types of things. But really, if we want access, all we really need to do is optimize for interest. If we create interest, if we get people to a point where they're like, tell me more, about that, they'll introduce us to anybody in many cases. And again, that goes back to what I was talking about. It's not because necessarily of what we are offering. It's because of how good it makes them look that they discovered this person has this whole new way of looking at things.
There's a lot coming out of all that. We could start the podcast all over again, purely on the questions I have based on what you've just shared. Let's start. We've got a few minutes, so let's cover 2 or 3 of those things. Let's start with, I think it's a really important concept here, building on the last point of engaging people's curiosity. Because if you want people to retain the information, to repeat it accurately in the way that you talked about at the beginning of the answer, they need to be a participant in the conversation. So is it a key thing for you to to stimulate conversation rather than deliver presentation?
Oh, yes. All the time. I focus on curiosity. I think about when I write my emails. I write a daily email, and when I write my emails, I think of my subject line. I think of how I want to frame it, and I think of my writing as like an episode of Breaking Bad. I want you to read that subject line as if it were the opening scene from an episode of Breaking Bad, where you're just like, I don't know what's going on. I need to try and figure it out, and I need to read more. I need to look into this more to figure out that information. And I love creating that type of dynamic. I'm always asking myself, not what can I add, but what can I take out? I'm always asking myself that. Every time I put something together, I say, okay, that's interesting. If I take out something, how much will this, how much more curious will people be if I leave this concept out, if I leave this idea out, if I just frame it as this piece is missing, right? And when I do that, what happens? People become enormously curious, and they follow up, and they want to learn, they want to know more, right? So we're doing this live, right? And if I said something on this call that was like a teaser, right? People would be motivated to contact me about whatever that teaser was. Right? So if I said that there was something sort of rooted in psychology that can make it so that you never have a loss for coming up with ideas, and I do it using a simple household chore, you're curious, aren't you?
Yeah.
Like you would want to know like what that thing is, right?
Yeah.
I'll give it to you real quick because I don't want to. I don't want to tease anybody.
Oh, I thought it was a hypothetical. Right. Okay.
Right. I'll give it to you real quick. But it really is a thing. So our subconscious mind is where we usually fuse our ideas together. So if you're doing an activity that actually doesn't take a lot of thought, you're far more likely to come up with new ideas and fuse concepts together that you normally would not fuse together. So personally, I get most of my best ideas and subject lines for emails and all these different types of things when I'm doing the dishes. At the end of the day, because it's a very remote sort of automatic activity, and what that does is it allows my subconscious to just play, right? Because I'm so focused on doing the dishes and getting that, and getting that work done, that my mind can just sort of wander, and that's where a lot of those connections come from. So any activity that falls into that category where you don't have to think about it is a fantastic tool if you're ever feeling blocked, or if you're ever feeling like you can't come up with new concepts.
I remember many years ago, a dear friend of mine, Kenny Harris, who passed away sadly a few years ago. He was a speaker on creativity. Thank you. And he said, you get, creativity wise, you get your best ideas very often. His example was in the shower. So he actually had marker pens, but the ones you can wipe off in the shower, and he would write his ideas on the tiles. Those little creativity tips, that one has always stuck with me. With my walls, I think I might get in a lot of trouble if I tried that particular example. But equally, having my iPhone near the shower isn't the best idea either. Okay, look, as I said, we could carry on with this, but I've got one more question because of time. But I think it's something that, based on what you've just said, I think it's important to pick up on. So, I picked up a phrase from an American speaker. I'm not sure who. It was on an NSA, National Speakers Association of America CD many years ago, and they talked about the importance of a message being two things: sticky and transferable. Sticky means you can remember it accurately. Transferable means you can repeat it accurately, which I think is a lovely summary of what you shared with us there.
Yeah.
One thing that you use, but I don't think you specified, which would be an important part of that to my mind, would be examples and stories. So what type of role do they play for you in creating a message that enables people to recommend and refer you with ease?
Yeah, I think that storytelling. There's all sorts of information out there about this, what it does to the brain and how the brain lights up in sort of a different way. So any time that you can attach a story or create a metaphor for something, you're going to have a higher level of comprehension, right? You're going to have a higher level of understanding. And back to when I was an English teacher, like if you could get the kids to sort of see the concept in the idea of a story, they would actually remember a lot more concepts if you tried to put those concepts into a story or some kind of metaphor. So we're all that way. Like if we have a story or a metaphor that's presented to us, it's going to make it much, much easier to tell somebody else about it, to sort of break that concept down. The way I think about it in regards to content is I like to think about it as tell a story, teach a lesson, give them homework, right? Tell them something that's interesting. Say, this is why I'm telling you this story. This is the lesson, here. And here's something that you can do. Here's something that will help you within this moment. And it works very well as well in presentations. For anybody who's doing presentations, it works incredibly well to be like, okay, I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to teach a lesson about it. And then I'm going to give you this activity to do, so that you can experience it for yourself, so that you can go through that, that process. And people will remember it because they'll remember experiencing it. They'll remember thinking about whatever that concept was or whatever that, that thing is. They might even remember the group that they were in when they did that exercise, or, however it works. So that's the way that I would think about that.
Yeah. And look, it is something we've covered on the podcast before a number of times. One of our, I believe, mutual friends, Todd Churches, joined me to talk about his visual leadership concept. Stories, metaphors were a core part of that. Another podcast where we got all Shakespearean, as we would with Todd, another English teacher. And I think it's a core part of getting that message across. Michael, I'm going to repeat myself again. We could carry on for ages on this. I think we've really just started to dig into the topic. It's interesting for me as someone who talks specifically on the same topic as you to take the seat as interviewer rather than interviewee on this topic and shut up to a degree, just let you chat, because I wanted to be bursting in and say yes and yes. But I hope that the combination of the two of us has made it more interesting for listeners to the podcast than just me wittering on about it. I really appreciate your perspective. It's something that I can back completely, which is why I joined. Invited you on. So thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was an absolute blast, and I loved all the different directions we went. We went with this one. It was a lot of fun.
Definitely, and there were more to travel. So thank you very much to Michael. I really hope that you enjoyed that and found it very practical as well. I get a mix of guests on the podcast, some of whom are sharing an inspiring story, something they've achieved. We've had Olympians on, Charlie Kamada, the astronaut, and Nobel laureates and so forth, and others which are no less inspiring, but much more in the practical vein. Do this, do that, try this, try that. Michael's an expert on his topic, and I think shared a lot of practical advice. So that's out for you to go out and get recommended, get referred, and use those tips effectively. As I said at the very beginning of the broadcast, I do hope you'll join us again. We've got 2 more dates in the diary in the next 10 days or so. So this Friday, I will be interviewing Rebecca Robbins of Interbrand. We'll be talking about how to nurture the next generation and enable them to build the connections they need to be successful in their career. We'll be talking about Interbrand's Horizon board. Interbrand, if you don't know them, is one of the largest branding companies in the world, and they have a board of up-and-coming, younger non-execs who shadow their main board, and we'll be talking about them as well. And then the following Friday, I'll be interviewing Pat Nevin, the former Chelsea, Everton and Scotland winger, about how he stood up to racism in the 1980s, how he stood up to hooliganism, how he built great relationships in dressing rooms where he had a very different personality and different interests to many of his teammates. 2 interviews that I'm really looking forward to. So that's the next 2 Fridays. Rebecca will be at 9 a.m. UK time and Pat will be at 9:30 a.m. UK time. So make sure you join me for those. They are already posted in Facebook, LinkedIn and YouTube if you want to find the events and set a reminder for yourself. In the meantime, if there's anything you want to hear on the podcast, let me know. We will be back with the Connected Leadership podcast in podcast form from February the 6th. It's on a break at the moment, but that's the perfect opportunity. If you're out in this lovely weather with these great sunrises and sunsets at the moment, if you're out walking like I am or you're going for a long drive, stick on a podcast. There's plenty of back catalogue episodes in the archive that you may need to catch up on. So please ensure you do that. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining me and for joining Mike on the Connected Leadership podcast.